either live by the gun or you die by the sword.
Chris, oh Chris, why doth the stars align in two dipshit lovers forced to die? In a relatively sizable closet, this recording taketh place, as we welcome fair listener to the good, the bad, and the weird. I'm Nicho.
And I'm Chris. Very nice poetry.
So nice.
So nice.
Writing it this morning at 7.
I'm impressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, good job.
Just rip off Shakespeare and change some words.
Yes. Yes. So, in honor of ripping off Shakespeare, but not changing a single word, we're watching Romeo plus Juliet.
Oh, this movie. I was introduced to this film back in high school. Yeah.
This was a high school film for me.
Freshman year of high school.
Yep.
I think my teacher wanted us to try and relate to it a little bit instead of showing us like the 80s. Old ass.
You were introduced via education. I was introduced because I had a good half of my friends wished that we were emo, which I guess now makes us emo. And this movie spoke to a lot of my friends on a spiritual level because they loved Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare in general, even though I would argue that most of them hadn't read any Shakespeare.
Yeah, I've never been a super huge fan of Shakespeare. I've always liked tragedy to be very much so the Greek tradition where it's a fatal flaw and just not like someone being kind of a dipshit.
See, and I have always liked Shakespeare, but I have never been a massive fan of Shakespeare-themed movies. I've always really preferred either like the original play settings that, like, especially like I feel like a lot of local theater groups will put on during the summers at night with popcorn. Yeah. Or like the over-the-top level productions starring dear Benedict Cumberbatch.
Ooh, Beeblebop Cumberbun.
Yes.
So, this rendition, for those who aren't familiar,
yes,
it is Shakespeare.
It is Shakespeare.
And it is using the original, or mostly the original dialogue.
Yeah.
And it takes place in the 90s, Florida, California?
Okay, so they kind of made up a place for this. But filming-wise, I believe it was mostly a conglomeration of Australia, which was where a lot of stuff happened.
I think it was Mexico.
There was some...
The beach was Mexico.
The beach was Mexico because I have a story about the Mexico part. And then there was some in California on a stage. And then I want to say there was somewhere in New Mexico also for part of this. It was a little bit of filmed everywhere. It's supposed to remind you of somewhere between, like, I don't know, it kind of has a Brazil vibe, it kind of has a Chicago vibe. It's a weird movie. It's a weird movie. I like the setting because while it does, especially the beginning of the movie, spends a lot of seconds showing you bits of this city to make it feel like it's in a real place without actually being in a real place. It kind of has a Florida vibe. It's got that tropical vibe. It's got that kind of beachy, lots of sand everywhere, wind swept going on, but at the same time maybe a little bit more Carnival style here and there, but also real gritty, real grungy, a lot of crime. Yeah, it was very much kind of like Romeo and Juliet meets, I don't want to say The Godfather because that's giving it too much credit. No, that's too classy of a gang. Bring it back down. Oh God, I don't know. Yeah. It's like a gangster movie meets Shakespeare. Yeah. And like, I think the director said it was MTV inspired. Oh, you can see the MTV in this one, which I appreciate because I think that's part of this movie's success. Because this movie, like you said, all of the dialogue is from the original play. It might have been shifted on who says what a little bit here and there. I think a couple characters changed family sides. Or not family sides, more so the names. There's definitely some name flipping just to make people make sense in a modern world. Do they change roles? Not really. No. There's a couple, like if you're a diehard Shakespeare person, I think you could probably make an argument for a couple of the side characters. But for the most part, this is a direct interpretation of the original play. And as such, I have found, last minute, the only drink in this gosh darn movie. So, there is a party, and there are people drinking at the party, but it's never really clear what they're drinking. And I think that's for a reason. So back in Shakespeare time, we think of wine as being Shakespearean for some reason. Or at least I do. However, wine was expensive back then, and a lot of people wouldn't have been able to drink it. And Shakespeare, part of the reason why he has managed to remain relevant for so long, is his plays were meant for everyone. Everyone from the lowest drunkard all the way to the queen. Mm-hmm. So today we are drinking the only drink I could find related to Shakespeare. So specifically, Romeo and Juliet. So in the original play, Romeo and Juliet, aqua vita is mentioned twice in the play. And I believe aqua vita just kind of loosely refers to a very strong alcoholic spirit. Mm-hmm. We think of it as brandy nowadays, so thankfully you had brandy. Yeah. So we're having brandy. But it was kind of used more medicinally, / also you could just drink it. Kind of like in oldie-timey movies where they're like, oh my gosh, she's having a shock. Quick, get her a shot of brandy.
Or whiskey.
So, cheers.
Prost.
I think specifically the maid calls for this drink twice. Ooh, this is spicy.
It's a cheap brandy.
It is a spicy brandy.
I mainly use it for cooking.
I'm glad I poured a very small amount.
Yeah.
But I think mostly the maid calls for this drink in the play. In the movie, I'm stretching it here, guys.
Yeah.
This is what I got. They drink pool water. Surely they drink a little pool water. They jump into the pool like 5 times.
I mean, he ducks his head in the water at the party.
Yeah. So, other than poison and drugs, neither of which I was going to bring today.
Oh, darn.
So sorry.
Oh, that would be so bad.
It would be a horrible episode.
Oh, yeah. It totally would be.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this movie, where to start?
That's a good question.
I kind of want to go over a little bit of, like, the origin of Romeo and Juliet, because I didn't realize how old the story is.
Oh, yeah. Dumb lovers being dumb is quite the original.
Well, I know Romeo and Juliet is our standard for, like, the archetypal young love interest, brash, oh, we're gonna get married and run off.
Yeah. Definitely. Cliche at best.
Yes. And from what I found, the earliest sources, and this is quick Wikipedia search.
My favorite kind of research.
It's a story that dates back from antiquity, but the first writing we actually have of this standard story is Pyramus and Thisbe. Super old. I think Babylonian.
That sounds right.
I don't know. It's old as shit.
As they say, a tale as old as time.
God damn it. Except they're both beauties and no beast.
I mean, by their standards.
Yeah. And so, that being the basis of all these stories that come from it, the plot for William Shakespeare specifically is based off a translation of an Italian tale called The Tragic History of Romeus and Juliet, translated by Arthur Brooke, and it was first retold in 1567.
There we go.
Palace of Pleasure by William Painter.
Oh, hi, Charlie.
And Shakespeare adapted and improved upon it.
Yes.
And even then, there's earlier versions. Like, the earliest version I heard of was Marito and Gianosa by Mascucci Salernitis. Nitano.
That's some real good Midwestern pronunciation you did there.
I speak the best Italian. My Italian teachers would be so happy with me now. And that one is from 1476. And that story ends quite a bit differently.
Yeah.
Marito is caught and beheaded when he comes back. And Gianosa dies from grief.
Yes. There's also some other changes that, as this story has aged, not just Shakespeare, but as in general, we have changed to go along with it. Mostly the age of the two characters.
Yes.
So, originally, I believe the age gap was on the fishy side by our modern standards.
By modern standards. And even then, from my understanding, after Shakespeare released his version and passed away, they kept editing it to remove things that were indecent.
Yeah.
Until the 19th century when they brought it back and they're like, let's just keep it as it was.
Yeah. Which, I mean, I think is part of retelling a tale like this. You have to make it more palatable to modern people. Otherwise, you do get caught up on the bits that don't jive anymore. Yeah.
And there was a quote in the special features from the DVD by Professor Jonathan Bates.
Yes, I know. I know this person.
I do not. I only know him from this very brief interview and quote.
Fair.
And
that's fair.
I think he was a Shakespeare historian.
Yes, he is.
Okay. He said, the best Shakespeare is always Shakespeare made contemporary.
Which I think is a fair statement.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree too. Partly because recently I picked up Throne of Blood, which was Akira Kurosawa's remake of Macbeth.
Yes. Oh, I love Macbeth.
Remaking it's great. I mean, he does a fantastic job.
Well, and part of the Shakespeare world in general is the retelling of it. However, I would say that most attempts for it do not succeed in the way that this movie did.
No, they really don't.
Yeah, there's kind of two big camps from my research. There's the direct play adaptation to movie, which usually fails because plays are over the top. It's all about you experiencing it live with these characters and the space and the experience and the over-the-top acting and the wholeness of play and theater, which doesn't always translate very beautifully to movie.
No.
We've seen a lot of attempts, especially in the musical world recently. Arguably, those are getting better.
Yes.
Except for Cats. We're not going to look that one in the eye.
Which, by the way, Oscars was this weekend.
I heard.
Did you see what they did?
Yes. Yes, I did.
Oh, that was great. And then they started batting the mic and...
Oh. You know what? Okay, and this is coming from someone... I love Cats, the musical. The original one, the new movie, I have some problems with. But the original one, I actually do love. My grandma and I used to go see it every time it was in Columbia. We loved, the two of us, this was like a bonding thing for the two of us. We both loved singing Memories in the car on the way home. Neither of us should have been able to sing that song. But, so I love that movie. I love Cats in general. The new one, arguably not to my taste.
Yeah, my only memories of that was when it was in Alaska.
Oh.
And they were promoting the Broadway VHS.
Ooh.
Where they had like the big boxes on their feet and whatnot.
See, okay, part of Cats was seeing it live, and I think that's similar to how Romeo and Juliet has always been. Mm-hmm. It doesn't translate super great to just straight movie.
No.
Or it got way translated. Example being Romeo and Juliet, which I know a lot of people hate. I love it. It's adorable. They're clinkety and they're clackety, and I think they're so cute. However, I understand why people don't like it.
Yeah, I would. I don't know. I haven't seen it.
I was one of the few people who was genuinely disappointed that my husband refused to take me to go see Romeo and Juliet, the Sherlock Holmes version. The second one.
Oh, jeez.
I'm gonna see it sometime. I will get around to it.
Well, I mean,
but this one doesn't. This one lands somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, it really does fall under that happy medium. Like, I don't know. It has that right amount of pop culture. Unlike, I'm gonna reference this movie because I learned this version of Romeo and Juliet, directed by Baz Lerman.
Good luck.
Lerman.
I got nothing on everyone's pronunciation except for Leonardo DiCaprio. I can pronounce his name.
This movie is part of a trilogy, kind of like the Cornetto trilogy, where he directed 3 films, all kind of around somewhat classical stories and adaptations.
He felt that they were all connected, and that's good enough for a box set.
At least the Cornetto trilogy has a cornetto in it at some point.
True.
But the other movie I watched in this trilogy was Moulin Rouge.
Oh, I love Moulin Rouge.
And
it's been a while.
For me, Moulin Rouge didn't hit as good as this movie because I felt that one was too much of a blur and just a mess of a mash of pop culture.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying there.
Yeah.
Moulin Rouge...
Specifically the opening act where they're doing all the dancing, throwing in Nirvana and
Fair.
A bunch of other crap.
Well, and arguably Moulin Rouge needs less to update.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Romeo and Juliet, especially the original play, a lot of, especially when you're first introduced to this in high school, for most of us, it's very easy for a lot of, especially us cynical high school teenagers, to say, oh, what young idiots. No one would ever do this. This is so unrealistic. But when it's brought into a more theatrical movie setting, you kind of let it get swept away like you were originally supposed to.
Yeah. Well, somewhat.
Are they still idiots? Yes. Is it a little bit more understandable through the movie and the updating? A little bit.
They're still star-crossed dipshits, in my opinion.
Oh, they are for sure star-crossed dipshits, but they're less old-timey star-crossed dipshits, which does make a difference.
Even then, I don't think they're old-timey. I still think they're old-timey dipshits.
Well, by today's standards.
Well, I mean, honestly, the thing is that the dialogue doesn't change. No, it's all the same. It's just the setting. And I think that's the genius of this movie. It really is.
I also love that there is a level of acting passion behind Shakespeare in general that normally doesn't make it to a movie setting. With the exception of this one, because Leonardo DiCaprio desperately wanted this movie. He was like the driving force, some people said, behind getting this going.
Well, I think, from what I remember with his interview from the DVD set, is that he wasn't super into it at first. And then when they started talking to him about it, he saw where they were going and what they were doing with it. And I think if it had been a classical setting, he would not have done it.
No, I agree. And I think that's the genius, because DiCaprio, especially this aged DiCaprio, he was a phenomenon of the time. I distinctly remember my friends going to see movies only because he's in it.
He was...
he was the teenage heartthrob for ages.
Who even is the teenage heartthrob now?
I don't know. You got me there. I don't know. Who's the gal who played in the Hunger Games? She's cute.
Jennifer Lawrence?
Does she count? I don't know.
For
I feel like the
guys, maybe, but...
I feel like the Chris's are the Chris's teenage heartthrobs now.
All the Chris's?
Yeah, like all of them at the same time.
Yeah.
Aquaman, is he... I don't know. Is he...
There's too many heartthrobs now.
I have never been a very good depictor of teenage heartthrobs. No. My first teenage heartthrob was The Rock. Specifically WWE, but I was too embarrassed to ever get a poster of him, so instead I got a poster of Aragon.
Mine was Sharon Sussaman from A Knight's Tale.
I mean, I also had a picture of Knight's Tale, but only because I was really enthralled with the naked guy, who I later learned was the guy who wrote the books.
Oh, Chaucer.
He cracked me up. I thought he was hilarious.
Oh, I love him. So, anywho... Back to this movie, and just kind of talking about some of the things they did to twist the classical Shakespeare story. We're not going to go into the story for this.
I feel like everyone should know it. I will say, as a reminder, this movie is surprisingly long. I remember this movie as like an hour and 20, hour and a half movie. It's not.
It's 2 hours.
It's a solid 2 hours. And every time you're like, yes, we're getting close to it being done. Oh, wait, no, you're supposed to die.
Yeah.
I forgot. We have to run off somewhere and kill you so we can come back here to kill you. Why? There's a lot of people just dying.
And you were mentioning earlier today that there were parts that you forgot that they were doing. Like,
I completely forgot the last showdown with the cousin.
Yeah, I forgot about Mercutio just shooting into the water randomly.
Yeah, fish in a barrel.
Fish in a giant freaking ocean.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta be angry sometimes, and I feel like the ocean's a good safe place to do that. Less ricochet. But, so instead of going over the movie in its entirety, piece by piece, let's break it down to what they did change from the original play.
Yes. I will say, my insight into this movie mainly comes from commentary by Baz Luhrmann.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be Baz. He's British, I think.
That makes it even more complicated.
He was the director. Catherine Martin, the production designer. Craig Pierre, the screenplay writer.
Yep.
And Don McAlpine, the cinematographer.
Yes.
All of them just giving commentary over the movie.
I watched something very similar, only I didn't finish it. I apologize. I got busy. I did, however, manage to watch several interviews with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes.
Yes.
Those are the two main... Well, hi! The two main actor and actresses for this, and thankfully, Leonardo does reminisce about this movie quite a lot, so I had a good amount to go through.
Because this was after Titanic, right?
I believe so.
Let's see, 1996 for this one.
But I wasn't a Titanic fan when it came out. This was more my speed, only because I thought the cinematography was closer to what I wanted. So I didn't really appreciate Titanic until, way later.
I was not allowed to watch Titanic back then.
That's fair.
That is not Titanic. What the fuck?
Titanic.
There are so many Titanics, apparently.
There are so many Titanic. Did you know they're making a new one?
97. This is before Titanic.
This is Okay, that makes sense because I was thinking in my head, I was like, he looks older in the Titanic movie poster. It's gotta be later.
Barely older.
I don't know. He does a good job of morphing between very young looking and slightly mature, but still young. Yeah.
Babyface DiCaprio.
Oh, I love Babyface.
There was one interview with him on this movie where he was talking about what he wants to be remembered in the future as an actor, like not just like a one-time heartthrob kind of actor, make movies that actually matter kind of thing.
I feel like he's accomplished that with having both Titanic and this movie under his belt.
Oh yeah, I think it'd be interesting. I kind of want to see him now, especially with being up for Best Actor for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
True.
Going from this to doing a Tarantino movie in, honestly, a relatively short time.
It's interesting because...
Well, 20 years, but...
Leonardo, I think, is one of the few actors who has managed to stay relevant throughout his entire career, which is really difficult because I feel like a lot of people get pigeonholed into doing a role. Yeah,
being the teenage heartthrob, especially being the teenage heartthrob.
Being the teenage heartthrob, being the middle-aged mom heartthrob, looking at you, Ben Affleck. Being the action guy, being the stunt guy, being that guy who can do kung fu.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to get pigeonholed or get burnt out. And somehow he has not really done that. He's managed to keep himself going. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a good place for those of you who aren't familiar with his earlier works. If you've only seen Titanic and then just kind of skipped ahead to all of the other ones, this is a good understanding of what the DiCaprio fever was like. If
you want to see him start off, Critters 3.
No, don't skip that one.
It is great. I don't care.
It is great. If you like the Critters franchise, I guess.
I do. They're fun.
They are fun. So, Romeo and Juliet, the first thing that you're hit with this movie that is changed but keeping the same is the importance of the place and time. So it starts off with a news blip that is quoting the intro narrative to the play. And this doesn't happen just once. It happens twice, back to back.
Yep. And the directors, I think it was the director, one of the commentaries said that it was to get people readjusted to the dialogue because no one talks like this anymore.
No. And there are, for the most part, once you get into the rhythm of it, you do kind of, it is a nice, poetic version of a movie, which is nice, and I don't see a lot anymore. I like poetic things. There are only a few instances where it really breaks a couple of spots, And only because, like, we didn't want to change the dialogue, but the action that is accompanied with said dialogue doesn't really carry the same weight anymore.
Yeah.
Specifically, I'm thinking of the early on in the movie, the scene of, do you bite your thumb at me, sir?
I do bite my thumb, but I do not bite my thumb at thee, sir.
And then he proceeds to bite his thumb in the most awkward small child way ever.
Oh, God, that's Jamie Kennedy. I forget that he's...
Yes, he is in this.
In that. Oh, now he's doing Tremors.
Yes, he is. Again. But biting the thumb thing, especially people who are into, like, the history part of Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet in particular, to them, it's the fun little, oh, but back in the day it was this. Whereas if we really were looking to update it, maybe a middle finger would have been a better pick. I don't know, maybe the British thing where you, like, shove a fist.
Up yours?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that, I think. But again, it's part of the dialogue, so it wouldn't have been a smooth
transition.
Flip of the finger.
It would have been a weird, awkward moment where he flips him off. Do you bite your thumb at me?
And yeah, like, it would have been awkward.
Yeah.
We maybe could have, like, done both at the same time, but then it would have still been weird. But honestly, while it was a little odd in spots like that, for the most part, you don't notice the dialogue.
Yeah.
It's kind of a fun rhythm game.
And they mentioned that also in this intro. First off, they did add a montage, and that was done by the editor. Yes. And I liked it because I felt it added that nice little bit of chaos that we were about to get into.
Yes, definitely.
And they also had a hard time trying to figure out, like, what modern setting could they use for this? Yeah, because
this is an odd one, because mafia and family feuds, especially in old world style Europe. Hi, Charlie. Are you so hungry at 5 o'clock in the afternoon?
The sun has slightly changed color, and it is time for feeding.
Yes, I have no food for you. I'm sorry. But so back in that time period, and even some more old school, old world, the vibe is still there. The feelings are still there. In America specifically, we don't really have this level of family style luminosity, but we do got gangs.
And that's what I think was great about this, is because from my memory of the 90s, it was strife with gangland style shootings. Yeah. And this kind of feels like that a little bit.
It definitely has similar vibe, especially with choosing to make everything feel a bit music video-esque. Because the time frame this is kind of hitting towards, there, especially if you were into the MTV style movies, there was a lot of rap and hip hop and pop, maybe a little bit more grungy pop that was definitely hitting on this style. Yeah. And there was, the whole East Coast, West Coast thing going on. It definitely brings you back to that.
Yep. And then they also mentioned that in the opening, they shot it like a Leone Western. Yes. Which fit very well because it brought it up to a more contemporary style of shooting. Yep. And then and that's the other thing, is they had to figure out, well, how do we modernize this? Well, they used swords back then, so how do we change this? So they brought guns with their models being like dagger or
long sword. I love the automatic rifle being labeled long sword. Just cracks me up. And honestly, that's the part of this movie, that and the cinematography, like the still shots, the atmosphere of this movie, that stuck with, especially the teenagers who watched this, that stuck with us the hardest. I distinctly remember friends who weren't even into the anime scene, like, would draw cute little guns with roses on the hill and little poem written across it, and like, you're silly. You're silly. You live in the most white neighborhood ever. You're very safe. Yeah. We're very middle class here. Calm down.
Yeah, I was in Nebraska at the time when I watched this for the first time.
Just rife with gang violence.
Part of Omaha.
So, yeah. A little, a piece of it. Yeah, I'll give them that.
Sorry, I'll correct myself because my mom will say this later. I lived in Papillion, not Omaha. Omaha is just easier because everyone knows where it's at.
I understand completely. Welcome to the Midwest, where none of our cities make sense. Yeah. But I also appreciate that there is an artistic style to this movie and how it chose to hold all of its guns.
Oh, yeah. And that was part of it, too, is they had to figure out how Is someone wielding a gun going to
show off the same theatrics?
Theatrics of a sword fight. And so what they did is they got a flamenco dancer to teach them gunfighting. So especially like Mercutio's gunfighting and what's his name? Tybalt?
Oh, I don't remember. Their names all kind of blur together in my head, which I know is not a good thing, but I've just accepted.
The guy played by John Leguizamo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I honestly, as he kind of falls under like that almost B-level actor, I actually really like him in almost everything I've seen him in. Yeah,
I do too. And I also like the costume picks for this movie. All of it is just as over the top and theatrical as you would expect from a play put into a movie that is set like it's a music video from the 90s.
Oh yeah,
the amount of Hawaiian shirts in this is a little jarring.
Juliet's Montague, right?
Yes.
Capulet.
What? I don't know. She's on one of the families.
One of them. This is bad.
Look, okay, it has been a hot minute since I had to actually understand Romeo and Juliet, and as we've discussed before, I have no ability to remember names of anyone.
Juliet's a Capulet.
Okay.
So the Capulets, their costume design, they talked about this a little bit, is that they wore their bulletproof vests as kind of like a statement.
Yes.
Whereas the Montagues had their Hawaiian shirts unbuttoned, just
flashing
Beach
their
Boy.
gun around. Yeah. And I also think that it was a fun and interesting choice to divide the families both in setting and in costume even more by creating one family who felt very high California style, very rich, very lavish, while the other one felt more like a bunch of high school kids being brats on a beach.
Playing gangster.
Very well, yes.
And then we have Mercutio.
Who's just,
he is probably one of my favorite characters in this.
He's fun.
Because generally Mercutio still played as a serious role, but in this one he really much was the instigator.
Yes.
But he was so brilliantly flamboyant.
Well, and I think it was kind of fun to experiment with his character specifically, because at no point did he feel horribly out of place. He just felt like almost another worldly character attempting to push the story along. And in Shakespeare specifically, that's not very uncommon. It happens quite a lot. And
my English teachers would be very upset. I don't remember a whole lot of Shakespeare anymore.
That's fair. I feel like it's one of those things that once, if you're into it, you're really into it. But I like his character because while he is jarring and he stands out from the group, I think it's kind of for a reason. Because if he melded in with the rest of the group, let's be real, the rest of the IQ of Romeo's friend group is so low that no one would have managed to do anything in this movie.
They remind me of the potato from Portal 2.
Yeah.
A little bit snarky, but a little bit dumb.
Yeah, and they're fun, and they're definitely playing their roles in how they're designed correctly, but you need someone to help push starstruck thinks a lot out the door and get going.
Yeah, even then, I would say Mercutio is more so the antagonist of the conflict between the two families.
Definitely.
And then the priest is more of the antagonist for the romance side of things.
Definitely.
And the nurse. Him and the nurse.
I like the nurse. Okay, I was watching this movie, and this is how weird my connection mechanism works in my head. I've seen this movie. It has been a long time, and I'm rewatching it. I'm like, oh, the nurse. I know her from something. And of course, my dear husband is like, well, you're a giant Harry Potter nerd. You know she plays in Harry Potter, right? Well, of course she's in Harry Potter, but that's not what I'm remembering her from. She's very briefly the aunt in Miss Franny Fisher's Murder Mysteries. It was a very short-lived crime movie TV series on Netflix, and she's the pushy aunt from that show, and that's what I remember her from.
I know how that is because everyone, I'll recognize characters from really obscure weird shit, like Paul Walker, the guy from Fast Furious. Is that the right guy?
I think so.
I know him from a movie called The Lazarus Project. Not even related to the Fast and Furious movies, which still haven't seen. But Yeah, Paul Walker.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, I know him from something random that no one else remembers.
And honestly, that's kind of the fun of this movie, is it is speckled with enough big names, or big at one point names, that you know them from a specific big movie, or from a couple big movies, that you recognize people, but it doesn't bother you that you recognize people throughout this movie. At no point are the costumes or acting or makeup so grand and so over the top that you lose a actor to the character.
Yeah.
But I kind of like that. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and even then, because we haven't talked about Juliet at all.
Yeah, okay. She is an interesting person, and then Juliet herself is... I mean, she's Juliet. What are you expecting?
She's a classical female romance character.
A very romantic character.
Very much so. Oh, I'm going to fall in love with this boy. We're going to run off. We're going to live happily ever after.
In her defense, I have known many a young girl who thinks like this, and then maybe shouldn't think like this, but that's just, young brains.
Yeah, and I personally think she's an interesting choice, appearance-wise, in this movie, because
I do too.
She's not the stereotypical 90s Britney Spears blonde bombshell.
No.
She's very beautiful,
but
in a different manner than what we expect Cali girls to look like.
For sure, and I like her as a choice as well, because, and one of the things that DiCaprio mentioned, because he was the one actually who requested that they test her out to see, because originally she wasn't going to be Juliet. Originally, they had cast Natalie Portman to be Juliet.
Not a bad choice either.
Except she was 14 at the time.
More authentic.
It was more authentic.
To be fair, she was in Leon the Professional at 7.
Oh yeah, no. This isn't a rip on her acting skills at all. However, at the time, DiCaprio was 21.
Oh, okay.
So even though that DiCaprio is a very baby-faced guy, especially, in his heyday, he could pull off a young high school look pretty easily, very convincingly. Specifically the pool scenes, people were remembering that they shot a couple of the pool scenes, and it looked a little molesty.
Yeah.
And so then they were going to look at a different actress who, unfortunately, I've forgotten who it was, but there was a scheduling conflict and she couldn't do it. And so DiCaprio was actually the one who suggested her, Claire, to do it, because he remembers that she was the only actress at the time that he was working with who could look him in the eye and not be flirty.
Yeah.
She wasn't starstruck by him, and
Soft, Charlie.
Yes, crinkle bags make noise. But she was one of the only actresses who fit age-wise, who he thought, could hold her own against him.
Yeah. No, that makes a bit more sense now. It
also, I think, makes Juliet more...
relatable.
More relatable, but also a more interesting character, because even though her role and her lines didn't change, her acting and her being able to hold herself up, even though she does look like a young, naive teenager the whole time, she's a young, naive, strong-headed, strong-willed teenage girl, not some starstruck...
Ooh, DiCaprio.
Yeah, she doesn't reek of I'm here on set being the typical Juliet. She does give off the feel of no, this is what I really want.
And that's kind of interesting too, because when they meet between the fish tanks, that whole scene for the most part was shot one-on-one with the camera because they couldn't get the lighting right to do one continuous shot between it.
Yeah, that would be really hard.
I watched that scene, and I have many questions about her motives. For one, DiCaprio turns around from pulling his head out of the water. She's looking into the men's restroom, and from where the camera shoots, as it crosses over to the side, you could clearly see that you could see the urinals from the fish tank.
Yes.
Poor design. But
yes. But also it makes her more fun.
Yes.
Yeah.
She's curious.
She's curious. Sure, why not? She's also, despite the fact that, again, her lines didn't change, she comes off as kind of bold for a lot of her scenes.
Yes. It's the it's the anime gender bender we see. Instead of the man looking into the restroom, it's the girl.
Which is even more hilarious, because one of my original favorite Romeo and Juliet animes was actually Romeo and Juliet, and the whole thing was a gender bender. That was the whole premise of the show. It was cute.
Yeah.
But this one, so that's how she managed to get in the movie, and while arguably I think a lot of people watched this for DiCaprio.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
she
yeah.
definitely did match him, and I think the only reason she's not as crystallized in this movie as DiCaprio is only because that's kind of how Shakespeare wrote this, is you spent more time with Romeo.
Yeah. And it really is more of a male-based movie than...
Which, I mean, for the time period, makes more sense. What Shakespeare wouldn't have known what Juliet did most of her
The first actor who played Juliet was a guy.
Yeah. And honestly, that's kind of part of the fun with, Mercato? Mercato. The one who's wearing the afro wig for the party.
Mercutio?
Yes, I can't pronounce anybody's name. But originally, a lot of the female roles were played by guys, and some of them were played so over the top that it would be on the verge of what we would consider drag comedy now.
Yeah, and I was reading somewhere that that's one of the comments about Romeo and Juliet, is that Mercutio is arguably probably one of the earlier homosexual characters, because there's very much some kind of romance between him and Romeo.
Oh, for sure.
And even if it's a one-sided thing, it could just be a bromance. I mean,
sure.
Yeah.
As Old Spice has led me to believe, bromances are forever.
Yes, Rick and I would agree with that.
Now, on to an interesting movie fact. Are you ready?
Hit me.
So, did you read about the kidnapping that happened while this movie was being filmed?
No.
So, as you mentioned, part of this film was filmed in Mexico. Pretty sure.
On an abandoned beach with a storm coming in.
Another part of it was filmed, I want to say it was New Mexico or something like that. But anyway, a different North America filming location resulted in one of the hairstylists, Aldo Signoriti? Signoriti? Not sure on that last name there, sorry. But he was kidnapped while filming was happening, and he was not released until they were paid $300, and then he was pushed out of a car as they drove away real fast.
That... Interesting.
Interesting, but also kind of hilarious how well that fits in with this movie's theme. Yeah.
I mean, it's...
$300, and this is from a true crime podcast listener.
That's
$300.
petty.
This feels real low.
I'm
not saying it's not. I'm not saying this is funny. I'm that's terrible that this poor person was kidnapped and held for ransom. But at the same time, $300 feels low.
I don't know. Can you imagine just being there and just overhearing the conversation? Hey, how much should we ask for this guy? I don't know. 300?
$3,000? Well, how much is $3,000? I don't know. 300?
Just the look on his face, motherfuckers.
Well, I just need 300 to pay off my car payment.
But
so yeah, the poor hairstylist was kidnapped while they were filming this one, which is very sad and upsetting, but at the same time, there's surprisingly little about it. Everyone acknowledged it happened and then kind of was like, yep, it happened, let's move on.
Yeah.
Which, I'd like to know more, please.
I mean, it is what it is. It's an interesting little tidbit.
It is a fun tidbit.
But, I mean, I don't know, it does actually fit it pretty well, because, I learned more about the set when they were talking about it. Especially, the beach scenes.
Oh, the beach scenes were fun.
Especially when Mercutio dies.
Yes.
That's... all the close-ups were shot on a stage, because this set had got destroyed, and there was a bunch of stuff that happened when the storm came in. So, the palm trees really blowing. Yeah. Not a fan. Just trees, nature.
Just a hurricane coming.
Yeah. And so, it's kind of interesting because now that they've said that, you can see specifically where it transitions between stage and...
Yeah, you can, but if you're just watching the movie straight out, you wouldn't notice.
Yeah, it's very fitting, though, too. It almost is like one of those happy accidents that just happens.
Yeah, it did. But also, please check the weather before you film. Hurricanes are very scary.
Well, and on top of that, I mean, you can only plan for so far out.
This is true. This is true.
But, I don't know. This movie really does fall under one of those weird little in-between films.
It does. Because I feel like when it came out, and then once you're in high school, everyone watches it like once. Mm-hmm. And then you just kind of never watch it again, unless you're really into this movie.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of one of those weird ones. Because for me, rewatching it after... Honestly, I haven't seen it since my freshman year of high school.
Fair.
I really enjoy it.
I would argue I enjoyed it more as a full adult than I did in high school. Because in high school, I was enamored with the guns and the styling and the posing and, oh my god, these beautiful shots. And specifically, Juliet's dress at the party. I loved that. Like, I loved the costumes. But most of the side characters' words and implications completely went over my head.
Yeah.
I was very focused on the romance between Romeo and Juliet. I was focused on their death and their hurt. And all of the characters who were offering warning or advice or hurt and hate on the sides completely blew past my mind. Didn't bother, didn't care.
Yeah. And for me, honestly, the middle is interesting. But for me, I really like the beginning and the end, especially once Mercutio's killed and DiCaprio goes on a high-speed chase after Tybalt.
Yes.
And just them screaming in the rain, either you or I, one of us must die.
Yes.
And just,
this town ain't big enough for the both of us.
Yeah. I mean, with the addition of guns... It's not much different than a Western.
There is something to be said between the Shakespeare poetry and Westerns.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's several overlapping themes, I think. Mm-hmm. And I also think that this movie, while the sets were beautiful to me as a kid, they were more important to me as an adult.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like seeing Juliet laid out with all of the candles and the memorial and the like traditional cathedral style setting, while impressed me as a youth, I found it much more impactful as an adult.
Oh yeah. Like, and that's the other thing too, is I really like the very end with the church scene.
Oh yeah.
The neon lights, which I like that the director pointed out that it was not lit by those lights.
No, that would have been terrible.
No. But
idea
But they felt like it. It felt like it was. And they got lucky because the head of the church wasn't really thrilled about them shooting in it.
I can understand that.
I do too, to a point. After they talked to him about it, I think he was more afraid that they were going to shoot a gun scene in there or have some shootout. Yeah,
well, and depending on how you want to interpret some stuff, I could understand even if he was like, no, I understand you're shooting Romeo and Juliet, but I really would prefer you not to have, a double suicide in my church.
Yeah.
Like, I could understand where he's coming from, but at the same time, the impactfulness of that scene, I think, lasted in a lot of people's memories.
Yeah. And it's classic Romeo and Juliet. They originally actually planned to shoot it in a mausoleum,
which would also, I think, feel fitting, but it would have...
They said it felt too stage and play like, exactly. And so that's why they went for the church.
Yes, I agree. Especially because the church gave room for more wide shot, which, the amount of stuff in that scene is part of the reason why it is what it is, I think. Yeah. Because if it had just been a church with the standard amount of candles and like a couple wreaths here and there and like one crying guy in the background, it wouldn't have been cool.
Yeah. It
also wouldn't have portrayed how much Juliet meant to people. Because, like, especially this, one of the only real complaints I have about this movie is while Juliet is clearly shown to be loved and cared for to an extent. I mean, she's got a weird mom, but, like, you know, that's fine. She's got a dad who needs some anger management classes. But I've seen other play versions who, in the background and off to the side without dialogue, show Juliet's influence over people around her a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And so at least they touched on it with her death. Yeah, and yeah, I don't know. It is kind of interesting just because, and we've actually neglected this character, the chief of police. Oh, I love how they redid the chief of police. I thought it was Captain Prince. Yeah, I mean they did such a good job with just reimagining Shakespeare. Yeah, without changing his role really at all. Which, granted, some of the characters I do think switched families, if I'm remembering right. Yeah. Does this really impact the overall outcome? No. But I do think some characters, like Captain Prince, who turns into the chief of police, does update the story in a really cohesive way. Cohesive and fitting way for meeting with the times. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It's a weird little movie. It is. It just... I also appreciate, especially because one of the books that I was very proud to find as a collector was a rather worn and used college copy of Shakespeare Abridged, which was several Shakespeare plays, and then off to the side was all of their dialogue meanings and breakdowns and like definitions. And so someone had gone through and clearly studied the crap out of this book. They'd highlighted stuff, they'd made notes, there was sticky notes still in it. I got it for $2. English nerds. Yes. And this movie feels like that book to me. Yeah. It's not dumbing Shakespeare down, but it's making it accessible for anyone to be able to enjoy. Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, especially with, I mean, we've hinted a little bit about like just the legacy of Shakespeare and the remakes. It's and from our weeb little corner that there's not a romance anime without a Romeo and Juliet scene where they don't. No, there really isn't. They don't do that. And I feel they always do some type of gender bending thing to it. And it's... Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the cliche thing nowadays. Yeah. Or there's even like a side plot that doesn't involve any of the main cast or characters or timeline where they just reenact Romeo and Juliet in its entirety. Yeah, and even then, of all the renditions and stories of star-crossed lovers, I think this one really holds out. Like, it does. The Wikipedia page mentioned that the romance between Kylo Ren and Rey was very star-crossed lovers, and it kind of pissed me off a little bit. It doesn't have the same weight to me. Like, I get what they were trying to imply, but honestly, it's hard to now, especially nowadays, to write two star-crossed lovers that have the same weight as Romeo and Juliet without just blatantly ripping off Romeo and Juliet. Kind of. I mean, I was actually thinking about this last night, and I was just thinking about all the different star-crossed lovers, or just the trope on them being affected by outside influences. Sure. And my mind immediately, honestly, went to Brokeback Mountain. Yeah, I can see that connection. And arguably a fantastic movie, too. It was very nicely shot. Yeah. I mean, the plot's pretty good, too. The story, honestly, I would have preferred it as a book. But, yeah. Or at least, I know there was a book that it's based off of, but, like, I want a book based off the movie. That's kind of like how I used to read. Okay, so there's a TV show, small sidetrack, but it's relevant. Kind of. There was an old TV show called Angel, which was a ripoff of Buffy. It was a spin-off. I don't think it was a ripoff. No, it wasn't. It wasn't a ripoff. It's just Angel, the one character from Buffy, out on his own doing his own thing. I've never seen any of the shows, so I can't tell you anything. That was my kryptonite. However, I never watched a single episode of the show. I read the books. which was just someone watching the show and typing out word for word what was happening. And then the only creativity in the book whatsoever was occasionally this author got a chance to like write out what the setting was, but often not really because it's all set in like dark dungy places.
Or like the I think I have the first one. A guy rewrote all the Star Wars movies as Shakespeare plays.
Yes.
And they are gold.
They are gold. And while normally I want a book version of the movie, this is one of the few instances where I got a really solid movie version of an old book. It's kind of hard to say happens very often nowadays.
Yeah.
Especially with a classical piece. We've seen other classical adaptations to things. Mm-hmm. But it's usually either done in some crazy over-the-top way, or not very well done, and I forget about it, and I don't want to own it. I don't want to watch it ever again.
Yeah, and especially in the time we live in now, I did learn that at the time when Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, it was very common to rip off Italian novellas.
Fair. So, this feels like an Italian novella. Even
Shakespeare's a ripoff, or Romeo and Juliet's a ripoff of something, or an
sure.
I wouldn't say a ripoff. It's an adaptation of something. Yeah. And for us, especially in the day and age we live in, which is the golden age of remakes or live action adaptations,
we've reached a pace where it's hard to make a new thing.
Yeah, a little bit.
It's hard, like, especially think about how many movies come out every month.
Oh God,
There's so many. And that's just the ones in theaters. You got all the B-roll movies, the straight-to-DVD movies, all of the just didn't even make it to DVD. It's only on the internet, only on YouTube, download-only sort of movies. It's hard to make a new thing and make a good new thing.
Yeah, because even Tarantino does something original, but he's a genre artist.
Exactly.
And so he pulls all these tropes and reworks them from what came before. I mean, that's just the nature of art and human evolution. We're going to rip off everything that came before us.
Exactly.
Like Hunger Game rips off Running Man or Battle Royale.
Sure. And I think the catch is do you retell the story in a way that newly impacts people? Mm-hmm. And so, like, I would argue Hunger Games does that. It managed to retell that story in a way that impacted not just a couple people, a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I would argue that this movie manages to do the same thing.
Or recently, do you go the route of completely reimagining an old story with Gretel and Hansel, which...
yes.
You have heard my bitching about this movie because...
I will eventually watch it because I watch every single version of Gretel and Hansel. But those two characters, and that includes the entirely horrific B-roll footage movie that I watched one time, accidentally believing it was the Witch Hunter series. It was not. It was on the verge of porn. Was not porn, but it was close. It was real tiddly close.
Tiddly close?
we were scraping by. I'm fairly certain that most of this movie was filmed illegally in a graveyard. Like...
the best kind of graveyard shooting.
No one was mic'd correctly. It was glorious.
You'll have to find it for me. I need to watch this.
One of these, I'll just give you a list of every Hansel and Gretel movie ever, because there's uncomfortably a lot. But in a weird way, there's an uncomfortable amount of Romeo and Juliet movies. And yet, honestly, most of the ones I either think of are way off the deep end, like Romeo and Juliet, or it's this movie. This is kind of the pinnacle for me.
Or me, on the other hand, who this is the only direct adaptation of Romeo and Juliet I have ever seen.
One day we'll have a small child's movie watching party, and you'll get caught up with me. So you'll finally appreciate all my references.
Like we're doing with Futurama and your husband.
Yes. I'm surprised he hasn't seen it.
It's shocking. So Chris... with this rendition of Romeo and Juliet, what would you rate it?
I would rate it, watch it twice in your life. Watch it once when you're a high school aged teenager. Mm-hmm. Watch it again when you're a full adult. Watch it after you're 25. Watch it when you're 30 or 40. It takes on a completely different meaning both times, and both times you will remember watching it. Mm-hmm. You will enjoy watching it both times. Do I think you need to watch this movie every single year? If you're really into it, go for it. We have a friend who loves this movie, and I have no doubt she watches it at least once a year. However, is it really like a thing you need to keep up on? Will like people talk with you about this movie? Once or twice, not every single week.
Yeah, I mean it's a good movie and passing conversation.
It's a good, like, I don't know who you are, let's get to know each other. Have you watched this movie before? What were your thoughts and feelings?
It is not how I introduce myself to people.
This is like a good icebreaker level movie. Like, oh, you like movies too? Have you seen this movie? Which is a lot easier than starting with, what's your favorite Shakespeare play? What's
your favorite horror film?
Exactly. This is a nice, like, safe intro conversationalist piece. However, especially watching it by yourself and sitting down and having the time to watch it, I recommend taking breaks. It is a lot.
Take an intermission.
Do take an intermission. It's a long movie.
Honestly, I feel like an intermission would have been appropriate in this movie.
I do too. But alas, it doesn't provide one. But this is one where I also do recommend subtitles. There's a lot being yelled real fast. And if you're not real familiar with Shakespeare, some of it will go over your head.
Yeah, it's a bit old.
It is a bit old, but it's fun.
Dialogue-wise.
Yeah.
As for me, I do recommend watching this movie as a curiosity.
Oh, sure.
I would watch it as a reference of how to do how to adapt old text well.
Sure.
And modernize it. Because you could have easily changed the dialogue to, instead of being Shakespearean, to match more of a 90s... Not necessarily 90s, just contemporary context. Especially with, like, flipping him off instead of, do you bite your thumb at me? Did you just flip me off? No, I didn't flip you off, man. And then flip him the bird again. Add a little comedy to it. But
at the same time, would it still be the same if they updated the dialogue?
No, it wouldn't. And that's the thing, is it did a fantastic job of towing the line of remaking and reimagining.
Oh, definitely.
And not even then just blending the two. It's not a straight remake, but it's not a straight reimagining.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even call it an adaptation either. This movie kind of fits somewhere in between all three of those things.
Yeah, I don't know. It sits in a weird place for me because I do have a little bit of nostalgia for it from the one time seeing it in high school. Just
Fair.
Because it stuck with me. That's how impressive that is that it sticks with you.
Oh, for sure.
But I don't know. I think only time will tell because we're kids who grew up in the 90s. If I show this to a nephew or a niece or a friend's kid...
Oh, my brother would think this movie's so stupid.
Oh, yeah. I forget your brother's so much younger than you.
Yeah. But, like, he wouldn't be thrown back to some music videos from the 90s when he watched this. As much as I hate to say it, it's starting to date.
Yeah.
The costumes, while amazing, they do look like they're from a certain time period.
They are a relic of the 90s.
They are. There's a lot of characteristics, mannerisms, action choices, acting choices even, that were very 90s punk street gang style stuff that I don't know if that necessarily translates the same anymore.
No, and honestly, I don't want it to happen, but we almost need another adaptation of it.
I'd like to see a very similar concept, but not with Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah. And I mean, all the stuff I've normally seen are like remakes of historic films, like Throne of Blood, where it's set in Edo, Japan.
I would argue that this would be a cool concept for some of Shakespeare's other works, and just every couple decades or so have another stab at it. Yeah. Because, like, honestly, I don't know. There's enough out there that this could be recreated and redone without feeling like it's ripping this movie off and not doing it a service. Yeah. And each one of the plays is so distinct that, like, I think you could easily pull it off. Like, a Hamlet is not Romeo and Juliet in any stretch of the word. Midsummer's Night Dream, even, not close. It's a completely different story, different feel, and I think it could be interpreted in a really fun new way if they ever got around to it.
Sadly, my knowledge of Shakespeare is Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and Shakespeare, and that is my extent of.
I think our local theater group does a Shakespeare in the park sort of situation for free. Maybe we can all educate ourselves this summer.
That might be helpful.
Yeah.
So, anywho, this has been The Good, the Bad, and the Weird.
Thanks for listening.
Peace.
Oh, okay.